This module is on progress reports. All of the documentation requirements and guidelines are found in the Medicare Benefit Policy Manual. Manual 100-2 includes more than 20 chapters, and Chapter 15 is the one that describes what is required in outpatient PT, OT, and ST documentation. The chapter, however, is named Covered Medical and Other Health Services. So when you go to find it, look for that one, and then go to Section 220 and 230 where you will find the therapy guidelines. National Government Services is the local Medicare administrative contractor for the state of Illinois. Therefore, you can find more guidance on its website. They have published a local coverage determination for outpatient PT and OT services, which all Part B providers of therapy in Illinois should be aware of. So throughout this module, there is additional guidance included from it. I did not include the web link for NGS because it's too long. If you Google search NGS for Illinois, then you will be able to find it. Medicare guidelines since 2008 have set out the minimal requirements for a progress report. They must be written by a clinician, and the clinician is defined as a PT, OT, or SLP. In other words, not a PTA or an OTA. It must contain evidence of the clinician's, the PT or OT, active participation in treatment. That means there must be evidence that the PT or OT or SLP treated the patient for at least one billable unit on the day the progress report was completed. The progress report should be done at least once every 10 treatment days. There should be objective evidence of progress. There should be an assessment and then a description of any plans or changes to the goals. Finally, there must be justification of why the therapist believes treatment should continue. They go on to say that clinical notes written by therapy assistants may supplement your record, meaning that they could assist in writing a progress report if they give objective measurements or descriptions of change relative to the goals. But they cannot make clinical judgments about why progress was or was not made. In other words, the progress or the effectiveness of therapy must only be documented by the therapist, the PT, the OT, or their SLP. These are the aspects of the progress report that can only be completed by the qualified therapist. The PT or OT or SLP must talk about plans for continuing or discontinuing treatment with reference to the evaluation results. If there's going to be any changes to the therapy goals or an updated plan of care. It's important that the assessment statement not just be a rehashing or a restatement of what's already been told in the goals, the evidence that's already been proven when you're reassessing your tests and measures. Rather, this should be a clinically supportable statement of expectation, an amalgamation of sorts, of how you're thinking about those results, what they tell you, and then how you're going to move the treatment plan one step further over the next treatment time. It's also good to indicate what you think the patient's prognosis is for responding in a predictable period of time. This is an example of a Rock Valley progress report. A patient was evaluated on January 22nd. The recertification, shown here, was written on 5/1. So there had been 13 weeks that had passed, and 0% of the goals were met. Therapy was continued at one time a week, but there were no changes to the treatment techniques. Now, this would likely fail a Medicare audit. There should be an explanation for what is going to be done differently if treatment is going to continue. It's stated that treatment is going to continue, but it's not stated whether there's reason to think that the patient will begin making progress, whether the patient might be put on a maintenance program, what the goals of the maintenance program are, because if these goals are continued, then these still show a plan to restore function, not to maintain function. So it's important that we address what our thinking is if we are going to continue to see a patient. This is another patient that was evaluated on March 1 and recertified on 4/12. After 6 weeks, 0% of the goals were achieved. Now, on the next page, there is more documentation here, but the therapist arrived at the assessment that the patient was making gradual progress. It's hard to find that if 0% of the goals were met. In the rationale, the therapist states the patient's primary goal is to decrease pain and return to function. However, what will be done differently? Given the lack of progress toward the goals, why does this therapist think the patient will achieve a goal of 0 to 10% impaired after 12 more visits? So these are examples of how therapists must really pay attention to what they're documenting. There could be an explanation for these two patients, but we don't see it. Is the therapist really checking what they're writing in the documentation? Are you ensuring that all fields are filled out? Remember that the therapist signing the note is the one responsible for ensuring its accuracy. Here is another example of a progress report filled out well. Each goal is addressed with the percentage achieved, but there's also comments to further explain how they arrived at that percentage. There are reasons given for why some goals are not met yet and explains what else needs to be addressed. For example, goal number 1, we know the patient is still having pain with some movements, so that this will be a focus of treatment. Goal number 3, the home exercise program needs to be advanced. Goal number 5, she is not allowed to do strengthening yet, but under anticipated treatment techniques, we know the date that strengthening can begin. So there's an indication of what is yet to be done and what will be done. Remeasuring all the objective tests and providing a status of the goals is so important on the progress report. Lack of progress is not always bad, but it should be explained. If the patient is not making progress, the clinician is responsible to indicate what will be done differently. If the patient has not yet made any progress, you can't expect to repeat those same things and the patient to suddenly respond differently. If they are not making progress and you have changed things up, then it may be time to transition the patient to a home exercise program. Remember that the readers of our notes are not always therapists. So if you think increased reps or decreasing pain is good, then explain why. What does it mean for recovery of the injury? What does it mean for the patient's functional ability, for their dependence on caregivers, for their return to community? Relating it back to the patient's goals keeps you on track with the patient's needs while supporting the medical necessity of ongoing therapy. But it is up to the discretion of the PT to be sure you are taking the time with these progress reports and addressing what those individual characteristics are and addressing what reasons there are for why the patient may or may not have shown progress. It also allows for better utilization of the patient's benefits because perhaps the same therapist is not able to see the patient every visit. So by leaving a plan, by leaving your thoughts on what needs to be done next and focused on next, then the patient can continue to make progress on every visit, and every visit matters. That concludes the module on progress reports.